Hello everybody, I'm Dr. Sneha Patel from MB Patel English Medium Secondary and Higher Secondary School. Students of 12th Standard, it's time to study psychology. We have already begun with Chapter 2 and the name of the chapter is Learning Skills. In our previous lectures, we have dealt with the topics like meaning and definition of learning and its characteristics, learning by emulation, and learning by trial and error. Today, we'll learn learning by classical conditioning. Learning by conditioning. What is conditioning? It means to associate. It is one of the simplest methods of learning. The process of training or becoming familiar, accustoming a person or animal to behave in a certain way or to accept certain circumstances is called conditioning. In this kind of learning, an individual experiences a series of sensations in the brain, and so on presentation of a stimulus, it evokes a response associated with it. In the morning when you look at your grandparents, what do? You greet them. Your grandparents are the stimulus, and your response is greeting them. When a teacher enters a class, a teacher is a stimulus. What will be your response? You stand up to wish the teacher. As soon as ice cream comes in front of you, or you buy an ice cream, that is a stimulus. What will be the response? Happiness on the face and satisfaction. Okay, so this is the association of stimulus and the behavior, which is learned. Example, different sound of the school bell is associated with different activities like beginning of school, change of lecture, recess time, end of school. Classical conditioning. The first investigator of this type of learning was the Russian physiologist Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, 1849 to 1936. And he was primarily interested in the physiological aspect of digestion. He conducted experiments to study the digestion process, but in his findings, he found something that is related to learning and behaving that even the psychologists also gained from his experiment. Traditionally, conditioning is also called as classical conditioning. He is Ivan Petrovich Pavlov. He conducted the experiments on dogs to study the process of digestion. He did conduct various experiments during which he gained a lot of information on conditioning, and the psychologists got the gift of classical conditioning from Pavlov. Pavlov was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. Pavlov was actually not a psychologist, a physicist who conducted conditioning experiment to study the process of digestion. He carried out his experiment on dogs. He used to do this experiment in the laboratory. The dog was harnessed in such a way that could restrict its movement. At the presentation of the food, the saliva of dog was measured. Food was the stimulus, and salivation of the dog was the response. During the experiment, he did so many things that when does the dog salivate? Just at the sight of the food? Or it could salivate at some other sound also, or some other stimulus also. And during his experiment, what he actually did was he made the dog learn to salivate at the sound of other stimulus other than the food, other than the natural stimulus. At the end of the experiment, the dog salivated at the sound of the bell. How? Let us study the experiment. Here, we can say that the aim of the experiment is the dog should salivate at the sound of the bell, and it does. How can a dog salivate at the sound of the bell? Let us study. Let us understand the experiment of classical conditioning. Pavlov designed a special stand on which the dog was harnessed in such a way that the dripping saliva would fall in the measuring glass, the picture you just saw in the previous slide. Food was presented before the hungry dog, and the dog started salivating, which was a very natural response. Dog was hungry, and what happened? The food was presented in front of the dog. So obviously, the response which was given by the dog was very natural. It salivated. The salivary response was noticed in response to food. The dog salivated at the sight of the food. A bell was rung. The dog did not understand anything. And then the food was served to the dog. And this action was repeated for some days. Sound of the bell plus food is equal to salivation. The dog actually salivated at the sight of food. But then the sound of the bell was produced before giving the food to dog. So the dog associated that food is associated with the sound of the bell. It learned that at the sound of the bell, first the sound of the bell will be there and then the food will be presented, and it gave the response of salivation. And this was repeated. After some trials later, the dog started salivating just at the sound of the bell, even before the food was presented before it. So the aim of the experiment was here achieved, that the dog salivated at the sound of the bell itself without the sight of the food, because it assumed that food would be presented after the sound of the bell. So this was actually the experiment of classical conditioning. Pavlov did not stop the experiment here, but he brought about changes in the presentation of stimulus to study in-depth learning of classical conditioning. Like the bell, he also pressed the buzzer. He used light as a stimulus, fork, whistle, etc. to study the response of the dog. Here you can see the stages of classical conditioning. Before conditioning, before learning to salivate at the sound of the bell, what had happened? When the bell was rung, the dog was just neutral. He did not give any response. But at the sight of the food, it started salivating. So what did the experimenter do? He presented the sound of the bell as well as the food, both in front of the dog. And the dog learned the association of the sound of the bell with the food. And it happened later that just at the sound of the bell, the dog started salivating. This is a conditioned stimulus, the sound of the bell. And the response given by the dog to the sound of the bell is the conditioned response, not a natural response. So this you can see what happened before conditioning, during conditioning, and after the conditioning. Let us watch the experiment to understand it in a better way.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps he thought the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
5 минут 42,5 секунды.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5. Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собаку.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. A ticking metronome. At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon, the sound alone made the dog drool. Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food.
Полная. Идите сюда. Что я говорил?
He called this new response the conditioned reflex.
Собака.
Whatever the stimulus, his dogs could soon be conditioned to produce saliva. Pavlov believed that he had discovered how animals learned, even in the wild.
Let us now go through some important features of classical conditioning, which are unconditioned stimulus, UCS, unconditioned response, UCR, conditioned stimulus, CS, conditioned response, CR, reinforcement, extinction, stimulus generalization, and stimulus discrimination. The very first one is unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned stimulus, UCS, is the stimulus that produces a response which is natural and not taught, is called unconditioned stimulus. In the experiment, food is the unconditioned stimulus, as the response that is elicited was natural and not at all taught. So, the stimulus which is responsible for eliciting, drawing out a natural response, that is called an unconditioned stimulus. The next one is unconditioned response. Unconditioned response is any kind of physiological response which is natural and not at all learned. It is called unconditioned response. Natural response is given to a natural stimulus. In the experiment, the response of salivation is unconditioned response. When does the dog give the unconditioned response? At the sight of the food. Food is a natural stimulus. So, the response is also natural to it. The third one is conditioned stimulus. Conditioned stimulus is a stimulus which is presented with the unconditioned stimulus in order to draw out an unconditioned response. In the experiment, sound of the bell is the conditioned stimulus. Sound of the bell was associated with food in order to get the unconditioned response, that is salivation. The experimenter presented both the stimulus, natural and conditioned stimulus, in front of the dog to get the natural response, unconditioned response. Conditioned response. Response which was not associated with a particular stimulus before. But after continuous practice, when response is given to that stimulus, then it is called a conditioned response. Conditioned response is given to the conditioned stimulus. In the experiment, the dog salivated at the sound of the bell. Remember, initially when the bell was rung, there was no response from the dog. But after the sound of the bell, food was presented, the natural stimulus was presented, and dog associated the two of them. And later on, it learned just to salivate at the sound of the bell. So this is a learned response given to a conditioned stimulus. Let's do a quick recap. What happened before conditioning? The dog gave a natural response to the natural stimulus, food. During the conditioning, sound of the bell was associated with food and dog gave the natural response, not to the sound of the bell but to the food. But this association of bell and food was continued for many trials. What happened after conditioning? Just at the sound of the bells, dog started salivating. Okay, continuous trials were given to establish this conditioning. And finally, there was establishment of conditioning. The dog started salivating at the sound of the bell. Conditioned response was given to the conditioned stimulus. The next important feature is reinforcement. Reinforcement is given by the experimenter. Reinforcement is any stimulus which strengthens or weakens the response. In Pavlov's experiment, food was the reinforcer, and it helped in strengthening the response of the dog because Pavlov wanted the dog to salivate just at the sound of the bell. And for doing that, he gave the reinforcement in the form of food. And that strengthened the response of the dog. As you can see in the first picture also, that a cat is sitting, but in order to get the food, it has to walk. So, in order to make the cat walk, the reinforcement in the form of food is given. The next important feature is extinction. It means to go away, disappear. At the sound of the bell, dog salivated because it knew that food will follow. But for several trials, only the sound of the bell is made without any presentation of the food. The dog will again learn something, that it's just the sound which is being made, there's no food. And what will happen? The dog initially, which gave the response at the sound of the bell in expectation of food, now it has learned that there is no food. So, the learned response of salivation, that also disappears. Extinction is that. If the conditioned response is not reinforced, that is, unconditioned stimulus food is not presented continuously for several trials along with the conditioned stimulus bell, then the conditioned response salivation slows down gradually and ultimately stops. This is called extinction. The next feature is stimulus generalization. After the establishment of conditioning, the conditioned response also occurs in the presence of other similar conditioned stimulus. It is called generalization. In Pavlov's experiment, after the establishment of conditioning of the salivary response to a bell, the dog also salivated at the sound of electric buzzer and also to the sound of metronome. This is called stimulus generalization. These images also reflect stimulus generalization. Like if you are crazy about eating pasta, then your variety of pasta is there. You will love everything. This is a positive thing. In the next picture, you can see that the girl is scared of dogs. So it is not only that she'll be scared of just this one particular dog, but her fear will be generalized. She'll be scared of any kind of dog, whether small, big. So this happens. Stimulus generalization means that whatever response that we give to one thing, we start giving that response to other things also. Like for example, when you come to school, you meet your class teacher and you greet that class teacher. And then you can come to know that other subject teachers are also there. So the way you start responding to your class teacher, you will start responding to other teachers as well. There are situations in life where we just learn once, but same response is applied to other things as well. This is stimulus generalization. The next important feature is stimulus discrimination. To be able to differentiate between stimuli and learn to respond to one stimulus in one way and the other stimulus in other way is known as stimulus discrimination. After stimulus generalization, if food is presented at the sound of the bell only and does not follow the sound of a buzzer, then the dog learns to differentiate between the two sounds. The dog secretes saliva only at the sound of the bell and not at the sound of the buzzer. This The dog will learn after many trials, through practice, through experience. Stimulus discrimination can be established after several trials. Learning takes place only and only through practice and experience. In these pictures, you can see stimulus discrimination regarding some object, situation, and people. In office, your behavior is extremely formal, but with friends, you don't care about any formality. After using a particular product, you will differentiate between the two, and your choice would be made what you want to have. That is, after using that, after experiences, that you come to make a choice. Students in the classroom, their behavior is completely different than what their behavior could be at home while watching television or being at leisure. So stimulus discrimination means that we understand the difference between the various stimulus and accordingly we respond to them. For example, if you want a raise in your pocket money, depending upon who is more friendly with you, father or mother, you will go to that person who is friendlier for a raise in your pocket money. Correct? Why? Because you differentiated between the response that would be given by both of them. So these are the features that we follow in our life. So here we conclude our today's topic. I hope it is clear to you. Read the textbook. That is a must. And watch the video again for a better understanding. Till that time, please do take care of yourself and study well. Thank you so much.